I'm Roland Hearn, and this is A Walk in the Garden. Across the years, I have been accused from time to time of not being entirely responsible. I tend to look at life in terms of the opportunities it presents and don't always consider the risk. I wouldn't want to give you the suggestion that there aren't times when I lie awake at night worrying about things not working out the way that I would like them to, because I do. I guess you could say I'm complicated. However, given the chance, whether it be jumping out of an aeroplane or eating a scorpion in Thailand, I'm probably going to do those things that sit outside of most people's desires and experiences. I remember years ago having a difficult choice to make and sharing that choice with some friends. When I had made the choice, one of those friends said to me, "I knew the choice that you were going to make." And when pressed on how they knew, they said, "We knew you would make the choice that was the riskiest." I never really saw that in myself before that. So, why would I make risky choices enough for people to notice them? And not just notice them, but to think that that kind of defines me? Well, I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable and honest with you in this video about that, because I think that's what the walk in the garden is all about. If I dig down and analyze it, I think the truth is I make risky choices because that is a way of establishing my worth, my value, my meaning. I think at some level, I think that if I do things that kind of gets other people's attentions, they will see me in a more elevated light, perhaps we could say it that way. And if that happens, then I will be more valuable. If that is true, then I am actually putting my own sense of personal worth in the opinions of others. Well, that might be okay as long as I can keep holding up things that other people might admire. But what happens when I do really silly things, or do something they fundamentally disagree with, or simply because they mistake something that I do and they feel negatively towards me? What happens to my worth then? Years ago, I wrote a book with a friend that had a chapter in it that was called Stupid Things and Why We Do Them. The book never got published. We actually didn't try real hard. But the point we were trying to make is that that worth, our search for worth, is our primary motivator for the things that we do in life. And we spend most of our lives trying to find a source of worth, or in fact multiple sources of worth. But the truth is, there's nothing that can ultimately give us a stabilized sense of worth, which is exactly where the existentialist comment comes in. However, for those that have faith, faith can become that stable source if it's constructed the right way. And for that reason, I want to address that issue today. I've reflected prior to now that I am a person with faith. I've reflected a little bit on who God is, and I've suggested that the context of this walk in the garden is in referencing to the biblical story of the original walk in the garden. So let's talk about God, shall we? I'm going to think about God from the Christian God perspective. I don't want to suggest that other people's journey towards God from other faith construct is a illegitimate desire or approach. Well, what I am suggesting is that I understand the Christian perspective most effectively. At some stage, I will try and address some of that and do it in a way that values other people's journeys. But today I'm going to focus specifically on the Christian God perspective. I think most people that are viewing this video would have that frame of reference. So there are many ways that we can actually think about God, and probably more than I can enumerate here and now. But let's have a look at a few of them, shall we? The first might be the atheistic or agnostic approach to God. That is, either A, God doesn't exist, or B, we can't know that God exists. A lot of people claim to be agnostics because they say, I just don't know. But actually, that's not the agnostic position. The agnostic position is we cannot know if there is a God. That approach is basically centered in an attempt to understand the world in which we live exclusively from that which we can perceive with our senses. It's not an inappropriate approach to things. And the truth is that no faith that is in opposition to the scientific endeavor can actually stand with integrity. So faith can certainly walk along with the scientific endeavor and join in that desire to know truth. We are dealing with two very different things in that approach, and there needs to be mutual respect in that approach. But let me say this: if your construct of the world or of God, or the way God acts, or any other framework is in opposition to the scientific endeavor, you probably need to think about that again. Two different areas, but can be a mutually validating pursuit of truth. Second construct that we might think about in terms of faith would be what has been called the deistic approach. That is, that God set everything in motion many years ago, and has stepped back and is watching it from a distance. That doesn't have a lot of followers in these days. It was primarily an age of reason response that didn't want to reject the idea of God, but wanted to recognize that the scientific endeavor wasn't conforming with traditional approaches to God, and therefore you could have your cake and eat it too. God, there is a God, he's way out there, he's not involved in our processes. Another way to think about God is to see God as engaged in every moment and every second of our existence, so that every point along the way, God has already worked out what is going to happen, and everything that happens is because God wills it and allows it. I struggle with that view tremendously, but there is a lot of people of Christian faith, perhaps the majority of Christian faith, that would have their construct of God somewhere in that area, and it's built on this concept of the sovereignty of God. One of my starting points with that struggle is that the idea of sovereignty is a human idea. So when that idea of sovereignty was placed against God, it came with an awful lot of human baggage. And so therefore, at the very starting point, there are some fundamental struggles that we could have with that perspective. But there is another way to think about God that I intimated a couple of weeks ago, and that's where I'm going to settle for the rest of this video. Anyway, let me just back up a little bit. In what I was saying about atheism, it may have sounded that I equated being an atheist with being a scientist or vice versa. That's not the case. You can be an atheist without being a scientist, and you can be a scientist without being an atheist. However, the atheistic approach, as the agnostic approach, says that that which we can know, we have to know through our senses. Ultimately, that which we can work with in the real world. And a scientist would say the same thing. So they lend themselves to equating, even though they aren't the same. So before I move on to this final exploration of who God is, I just want to say this. I'm going to attempt to speak about God without gender pronouns. I recognize I've already said he a couple of times, and and if I slip into it, please forgive me. God is beyond gender, and to speak of God in a way that represents God as gendered does a disservice to both who God is and who we are. The best way to understand humanity is in the combination of gender rather than the marginalization of gender, and so I'll try and be aware of that. So this last way of thinking about God, this way that I'm going to focus on, rests on a concept in the Bible that says God is love. It is clear that God is loving, and I think most people of faith would say that God is loving. But there is this foundational truth that God is more than just acting in love, that God is love. And while I doubt anyone would argue against that, what we don't often do is think that all the way through, and that's what I am going to try and do in this process. Love is a relational construct. It is a personal construct. And so the fact that God is love means that God is both in relationship and is personal. So when I say that God is love, that should not be misconstrued, which I've seen many times, as suggesting that God is some kind of ethereal force. God is not. God is personal, and God is engaged with persons in relationship. However, the fact that God is love means that God is fundamentally valuing. Remember, love and worth are two sides of the same coin. And for me, to experience God's love is, in fact, to experience worth, to experience value. It's to experience meaning. And so you might recall a couple of weeks ago that I said, if you don't have faith, come along with this journey anyway, because if faith has merit, it will be self-evident. It is in this truth that I find the most compelling case for God, that God did indeed love us originally, and that he values us enormously, so much so that God himself steps into human history, embraces humanity, lives as humanity, and ends up dying as a result of the brokenness of humanity. And then the Christian story says that he rises again as the triumph of love. And so when you allow yourself to focus in on the truth that God is love, it flows out very, very well, let's say perfectly, into this Christian narrative that Jesus Christ is the representation of God stepping into the world, living, embracing, loving, giving, and ultimately dying as a representation of his love, but more than that, rising again as a representation of his love. If God is love, God cannot control. He cannot make things happen, because love values through the process of empowering people and setting people free to find their own worth and a value. And so all the times across the centuries that the church has, at the point of a sword or through overwhelming attempts at compelling arguments, tried to force others to see the world from their perspective, they have done so as a direct denial of the validity and truth that God is love. And so love says, let's walk together. Let's journey in the garden. Let's define our worth in each other's lives. There are two books that I think really help us get our head around this journey. There's lots of books that will help with that, but there's two books in particular. One is called God Can't by Tom Ward, and the other is called The Theology of Luck by Rob Fringer. Tom would say that because God is love, there are certain things that God doesn't do, not by choice, but because he can't, but because to act in those ways would be to deny love. And so therefore he can't do them. It's not that he chooses not to, he can't, because he is love. Rob would say, we live in a world where random events happen, and trying to impose a perspective of God upon those events is an attempt to take control of those events. Both of those books will assert that to try and take control over our situations and circumstances is to miss the point. To think of God as taking control over our situations and circumstances is to miss the point at the most profound level. While faith in God always allows for the opportunity for God in love to step into our circumstances, God isn't primarily about the business of changing our circumstances. So many people pray, God, fix this, fix that. Even people that don't have faith will pray, God, will you help me? Help me how? Here now, if you help me, I'll go to church, or whatever it might be. Seeking an external power that would speak into our circumstances. But a God of love isn't first and foremost thinking about changing our circumstances. He is about changing us and making us more like love. So as we journey in the garden with him, we become more loving, which is more valuing, more giving, more embracing, more empowering. And so that's the picture of God that we would like to journey with in the garden. Not the idea of God making stuff happen, but the idea of God that says he's walking with me and helping me to become, empowering me, not just helping, but empowering me to become more loving and more love like him. I did it, more like God. The last thing I would say before I close is that because he is fundamentally loving and valuing, the struggle that we have with worthlessness and shame is actually a representation of the reality to which we have not understood or embraced his valuing love. And so the journey then becomes one of discovering our worth in the context of God's love. Talk to you next week.